I read this Wikipedia article, and it came across an interesting fact about the election in Idaho. It says that 1948 really marks the end of Idaho being a swing state. Um, how since then only two Democratic candidates in 60 and 64 have even achieved 40% of the vote. Then I found out there's only one of 8 states where Truman's margin had not been matched by any subsequent Democrat. The others being Arizona, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, Oklahoma, and Texas. And a lot of them are former swing states. Um, then it says in all of the non-Confederate states, Lyndon Johnson outran Truman's now victory. I was confused with this statement. Now, um, looking at Tennessee in particular, it's a case where Truman won by 12.3 and 48. Then you go to 64, and Johnson only wins by 11%. The reason as to why it's not accurate to really say that is just because 76, Carter wins Tennessee by 13 points. So more than 1948, obviously. But you have these states, and and it got me wondering why. And there's a few different things you have to look at here. And again, I'll just have this open so it shows the other states. And we'll look at Idaho first. Idaho was a long-standing swing state. Truman won the state by 2.7 percentage points, and it had been, a bit of a bellwether throughout American history. Going back through all these elections, the last time Idaho was wrong was when it voted for William Jennings Bryan in 1900. Since then, it was a reliable bellwether. Truman won the state by 2.7 points, winning 49.98% of the popular vote. If Wallace didn't run, I think Truman wins by about 5 percentage points. And, one of the more notable things is how in a lot of these states out west and in the Midwest, Truman really gained a lot of support that FDR didn't really have in 1944. That's the whole reason why Truman was able to win re-election, by improving his margins in the West, even though he just completely lost the Northeast, with a few exceptions. Looking at Idaho since, it voted for Republicans by landslides in 52 and 56, and even though those were blowout elections, I think the fact that it was as large of a margin, over 20 points both times, kind of does show you that the state was making a change. 1960 of the only, really close election as Nixon wins by 7.6 percentage points. And then look at 64, and look at this. In LBJ's blowout election, Idaho is the closest state to vote Democratic. Only 1.8 percentage points, although Johnson does win 50.92% of the popular votes. But still. And since then, the state's consistently been in a safe Republican column, which implies over a 15-point margin, as you can see here, with safe being about 15, likely being 5 to 15, and lean being 1 to 5, and tilt being anything less. And the sole exception was in 1992. Bush won by 13.6%. You had Ross Perot taking 27% of the vote and Grits taking 2% of the vote. Clinton is still held to only 28% of the vote despite all that. And Idaho is still, won't show here, actually move my camera. Idaho is still the third most Republican state in the country in this election, behind only Nebraska and Utah. And it's been and then it was one of only 5 states to vote in the safe Republican column in '96, and since then, a consistent Republican stronghold. That's the main reason. 1950 really marked when Idaho went from being a swing state, a bellwether state out west, to being a solid core Republican state. Now, Arizona is interesting. So, and then Oklahoma, and then we'll go through the Confederate states, which is kind of more of the same story. Now, Arizona, voted for Truman by 10 points. Arizona was a state that was, again, a bellwether state that was honestly a bit Democratic leaning. FDR won by 37, then he won by 43, then he won by 28, and then he won by 18. And even though FDR won by a lot, that was a lot more than what his national margins were. It was also some of the closest states in the Republican blowouts of 1920, 1924, despite getting them right. And Arizona, was a bellwether throughout its entire history as a state. In 52 and 56, it votes for the Republicans, though, by 17 and by 22. So a bit of a sign that Arizona is shifting to the right. In 1960, Arizona is wrong for the first time in state history, as Nixon wins by 11.2 percentage points. Even more stunningly, though, in 64, Goldwater wins the state. I know it's his home state. He wins the state by around 1 percentage point, but it's stunning, really, that as to how red the state was. And it was consistently Republican after that, too. Looking at all these elections, it was in a safe Republican column in the subsequent 6 elections. Before 1992, when it finally gets close, Bush wins by 2%. 1996, Clinton wins the state for the first time since 48, winning it by 2.2 points. So between 1952 and 1992, the only state to not vote Democrat at least once was Arizona, as every other state either voted blue in 64 or in 76, or both. This didn't last long, as Arizona would quickly return back to being a Republican stronghold. However, things did get dicey, looking at 2016 when Trump barely wins the election and he only takes Arizona by 3.5 points. Sure enough, in 2020, Biden wins, has 0.31% of a margin of victory. He had 49.36% of the vote, the highest percentage since Johnson had 49.45% in 1964. Remember that third parties had more of an influence in 2020 as compared to 1964. But again, another state that was a traditionally swing state, honestly, we have a blue-leaning swing state, that now, that was a Republican-leaning state, and even though it's back to being a swing state, it is still a swing state that leans Republican. Seeing as 1996 was obviously a bit of a blowout for the Democrats, and looking at 2024, now Trump is back to winning Arizona by 5.5 points. Oklahoma is the final state. This is a state that Truman won by 26 percentage points, and it actually used to be a solid, a pretty big Democratic-leaning state. Like in 1924, as an example, Davis, the Democrat who got blown out in the election, carried Oklahoma by 5.6 percentage points. After the Sooner state had only voted for Harding by 5.5 percentage points, and is roughly 25 percentage point landslide nationwide. And with Democrats winning pretty big in both 1916 and, and 1908, Republicans have a big win. Bryan still wins the state of Oklahoma. In the first election, Oklahoma is a state and can actually vote in. Now, Oklahoma was odd because in 52 and 56, it actually wasn't, that big of a state for Eisenhower. It was only around 10 points, which is less than his national margin, even though 10 points is still pretty good. It's just that the turn happened in the 60s as Nixon substantially improves on Eisenhower's margin, wins the state by 18 points. It was Nixon's third strongest state, and it was one of 6 states that swung towards Republicans in 1960. And look at 64, and Johnson only wins Oklahoma by 11.5 points. And since then, Oklahoma has not gone blue again. Carter came the closest by losing the state by only 1.2 percentage points. Um, but it's been safe Republican like ever since. And my camera's no longer working. Great. And again, looking at the other states, they're all antebellum swing states. These are states that used to be richly Democratic. In 48, they all won in a landslide. There's only, again, Tennessee is not, the four states that Thurman won are not, and there's one state that isn't, also Virginia, which Truman won by 6.8 percentage points. This is odd because Virginia was actually the most Republican friendly of these states, both before civil rights and also even after civil rights. It still was. This was a state that Eisenhower really did the best in of any southern state, winning by more than the nation at large. And then Virginia was consistently in the Republican column, save 64, when Johnson only won the state by 7.4 points. And it's a state that since then did not go blue again until 2008. However, by 2020, Joe Biden's 10.1 percentage point win in the state did actually outmatch Truman's margin in 48. They actually said that Biden had the biggest win in Virginia of any Democrat since 1944. And again, it's because Virginia's Republican friendlyship, while weak, was better than most other countries. Now it's the bluest state in a former Confederacy. But looking again at 48, North Carolina was 25, Georgia was 40.5, Florida was 15.2, Texas was 41.7, Arkansas was 40.7. It would never be matched in those states. Seeing as, looking at the next elections, only a few states even wind up being in the safe Democratic column as compared to before, when these states were safe Democrat. Many of them moved to the right. I'm not saying that all of them wound up voting for the Republicans, as Arkansas and North Carolina didn't. But there was at least progress. Then you have to get to 1960, when it was sort of split in a lot of these states. Georgia is safe Democratic, but it's only 25 points. And, you look at 64, a lot of these states that were some of the safest in the country initially now actually voted for Barry Goldwater, and they flipped. And while quite a few of these southern states still vote for Johnson, their margin is weakened. Like Texas is only 27 points for Johnson. Florida is 2.3. They would actually have a bigger Democratic win since. North Carolina 12.3. Arkansas 12.7. And then, you just sort of have these states become more Republican over time. 76, sure, Arkansas and Georgia are both blowouts, but they're only in the 30s in margin. It's still obviously a ton, but they're not like the same that they were in the 40s, when they were both in the 40s. They actually reduced a bit. And since then, these states haven't really been anywhere near since. Clinton, yeah, won by 18 and then by 17 in his two elections in the 90s, but it wasn't really the same. And by this point, a lot of Republican support was being gained in the South, and Democrats really lost a ton of support in the South. Looking at 96 in Florida, 5.7 points for Clinton in his best state in the South after, Carter won by 5.3. So there's a lot of weakening support in the Deep South. And we kind of saw this hold true when, 2000, 2004 close elections, the solid South is swept Republican. And, there were some elections where Democrats were able to get some states like North Carolina and Florida. But when they did so, they were incredibly close, like 2.8 in Florida and 0.33 in North Carolina. And then the next election, 0.88 in Florida, and North Carolina goes red. So there's really been a loss of support for the Republicans in the Deep South, and that's why this happened. Again, only in two states did we see Truman's margin being outmatched. Well, Truman actually won a state of the former antebellum swing states. Virginia when it went for Biden in 2020 by 10 points, and then Carter's 13-point win in the state in 1976. And in both cases, Truman in 48 outperformed Johnson in 64. It's just that looking at the perspective of more so after that, you see that the other states where this kind of happened in was more so Mountain West states that took a hard swing right in the 50s and never really looked back. And of course Oklahoma, which is like just Oklahoma. Because even in 64, some of these states, like in this region, go for Johnson by more than you'd expect. And you also understand at 48, not everywhere did Truman have the same support that he did in other states. Looking at Wyoming and Utah, Truman had nice margins. Johnson was able to outperform him slightly. 4.3 in Wyoming, 9 in Utah, and 48. Compare that to 64, where it's, 13.1 in Wyoming, so more than I thought, 9.7 in Utah. Montana, 18.4 for Johnson after Truman only won the state by around 10 points. And these states actually went for the Republicans in 48.